My dad abandoned me for his new family, and years later I finally learned why my uncle took me in. Alright, here's how I came to live with him. To really get the significance of this, we have to go back to when I was around 9 or 10 years old. My mom, who meant everything to me, passed away in a car accident, and just like that, she was gone. No one expects something like that, right? Especially at that age, it's hard to fully grasp what's going on. One day she was there, and the next day everything was different. It didn't hit me all at once, though. It came in waves, like moments when I thought she'd walk in the door, but she never did. Now, my dad was hardly in the picture, even when she was alive. By that time, he had already started a new family, remarried, and had more kids. So when my mom passed away, living with him wasn't an option. Honestly, I don't even know if he wanted me to stay with him. We didn't have a great relationship. I wasn't mad about it at the time, it just was what it was. So, my mom's older brother, my uncle, stepped up and took me in like it was no big deal. He didn't make me feel like I was a burden, which I now realize was huge. This man had his own family, his own child, my cousin James, and still made space for me. I didn't get it back then, but now I see how much he really did for me. He basically became my father overnight, even though no one ever said it out loud. My uncle's always been the type of guy who handles things quietly. He doesn't brag about what he's done for people, but he made sure I had what I needed. When I first moved in, it felt strange. I didn't really know how to act in someone else's home. They weren't strangers, obviously, but it wasn't my home. My room was already set up when I arrived, which was a nice touch. They didn't make me sleep on the couch or anything. It was like they were saying, "You're part of the family now," even if it didn't feel that way right away. James, my cousin, was around my age. We were actually in the same grade, which helped a lot. There wasn't any awkward older-younger cousin vibe, and he wasn't distant or anything. In fact, he treated me like a brother right from the start, which helped me adjust faster than I expected. But it was still tough. Losing my mom left a massive void, and even though my uncle and aunt tried to fill it, it wasn't the same. Still, I never felt unwanted, which, in hindsight, was pretty lucky. My aunt, though, didn't seem to feel the same way my uncle did. She wasn't mean or anything, but there was this distance. She was polite but not overly warm. It might have just been me, but I always felt like she wasn't entirely happy about me being there. She never said anything directly or treated me poorly, but you know when you can tell someone isn't completely at ease around you. That's how it felt. I always felt like I had to be on my best behavior, making sure I didn't cause any trouble. My uncle treated James and me equally. If he got James something, I got the same thing. When James got a laptop for school, so did I. If James needed new shoes, I got the same pair. It wasn't like I got James's hand-me-downs either. My uncle made sure I didn't feel like the extra kid, if that makes sense. I didn't even have to ask for these things. It's like he wanted to ensure I had the same chances as James. Looking back, it's wild how much he took on. Most people would have just done the bare minimum, but not him. The real game changer was when I turned 18. My uncle bought me a car for my birthday, even though I hadn't asked for one, because who expects that? He gave me the keys like it was nothing, like I deserved it. James got one too, but it didn't feel like I was just getting what James got. It felt like my uncle genuinely wanted me to have it for me, not out of obligation. That moment stuck with me. How do you even thank someone for something like that? By the time I graduated high school, I started thinking of my uncle as my dad, even though we never had that conversation. My biological dad had disappeared from my life, and my uncle had been there for me through it all. He covered my expenses, kept a roof over my head, and made sure I stayed on track when I needed it. But more than that, he gave me a place to feel safe after everything had crumbled. That's not something you can ever really repay, you know? Still, there was always this lingering feeling that I didn't completely belong, like I wasn't truly part of the family. No one ever said it outright, but it was the small things like my aunt not including me in certain conversations or noticing I wasn't invited to some family outings with my uncle and James. It didn't exactly hurt, but it was a reminder that I wasn't their biological son, just the kid they took in because they had to. But even so, I never lacked anything. My uncle made sure I had everything I needed, and James never made me feel like I was second place. We were more like brothers than cousins, and for that I'm really grateful. He could have easily been a jerk about the whole situation, but he wasn't. We hung out, played video games, did all the typical things teenage boys do. It felt normal, and after everything that happened, normal was exactly what I needed. So, yeah, that's how I ended up living with my uncle. It wasn't perfect, but it definitely turned out better than it could have. I know a lot of people who don't have anyone step in when life takes a bad turn, so in that sense I'm fortunate. I had my own room, my own belongings, and a family who looked after me when they didn't have to, and I'll always be thankful for that. I just didn't realize things would get more complicated down the road, but I guess that's how life goes, right? Just when you think you've got everything sorted, something comes along to shake things up. By the time I was in my early 20s, I was in a pretty good place. I had a steady job after finishing school, a car my uncle gave me when I turned 18, and a solid relationship with my cousin James. Life wasn't flawless, but it felt like things were going well. My uncle still acted like a father to me, even though we didn't always discuss deep feelings or anything. I knew he had my back, and that was enough for me. In my culture, owning a home before getting married is a big deal. It's expected that by the time you're ready to settle down, you got a house lined up. For some, this isn't a problem because their parents helped them out. The idea is that having your own home proves you're serious and capable of taking care of a family. If you don't, it can be a deal breaker for the woman's family. With my mom gone and my dad out of the picture, my uncle was really my only support. In many ways, he became my father figure, and he always made it clear he would help me, especially with major life things. I assumed that would include helping me buy a house when the time came, especially since he had already done it for James when he got married. I figured he'd do the same for me. Why wouldn't he? He treated me like one of his own. But one day my uncle sat me down to have a conversation about it. He told me he was ready to help me buy a house when I was ready to get married, but there was a condition, a pretty big one. He wanted me to change my last name to his. Now, in my culture, your last name is a huge part of your identity, your family heritage, and even your social status. So when he asked this of me, it wasn't a small request. At first, I didn't know how to respond. He explained that since he had raised me and treated me like a son, I should take his name. He also said it would honor my mother's memory since it was her family name, not my dad's. I understood where he was coming from, but changing my name felt like a big deal. People in the community would notice, and I didn't want to have to explain to everyone why I had suddenly changed it. It would raise a lot of questions I wasn't ready to answer. I tried to explain this to him. I told him that while I was grateful for everything he'd done for me, I didn't think it was fair to make changing my name a condition for buying a house. I wasn't outright rejecting the idea, but I needed time to think it over. This wasn't a decision to be made lightly, right? It's a big deal. But my uncle didn't see it that way. To him, it was straightforward. If I wanted his help with the house, I had to take his last name. No name change, no house. I remember sitting there feeling stunned. I hadn't expected this conversation to turn into an ultimatum. I thought he'd understand my perspective, but he was firm on his condition. After that, things between us became uncomfortable. We weren't arguing, but there was this unspoken tension that hadn't been there before. Every time we were in the same room, I could feel it. He wasn't being cold or mean, but it was like he was just waiting for me to agree to his terms, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. I honestly didn't know what to do. I didn't want to lose his support, but at the same time, it didn't feel right to change my last name just to get something in return. It felt like I was being backed into a corner. My aunt didn't say much about it, at least not to me. She just acted like everything was normal, but I had this sense she was distancing herself. I wasn't sure if she agreed with my uncle or thought I was being difficult, but she wasn't really involved. James didn't comment on it either, but I knew he was aware of what was going on. I ended up talking to a few close friends about it, hoping they'd understand my side. But most of them thought I was being ungrateful. They said I should just change my name and take the house. One of my buddies even said, "Dude, if someone's offering you a house, you take it. Who cares what your name is to them?" It seemed like a no-brainer, but to me, it was about more than just a name. I felt like I was stuck between wanting to honor my uncle's wishes and holding on to a part of my identity. I had spent my entire life being known by this name, and now I was supposed to change it for a house. I know that sounds kind of silly when I say it out loud, but it really bothered me. The worst part was that I don't think my uncle understood how hard this was for me. To him, it was a simple decision, and the fact that I wasn't immediately on board probably made him think I was ungrateful. Maybe I was, I don't know, but it felt like I was being asked to give up something more than just a name. I wasn't ready to make a decision right away, and that just made things more awkward between us. Every time I saw my uncle, I could tell he was waiting for an answer. I knew I couldn't avoid it forever, but I wasn't ready to say yes or no yet. So I did what I usually do when I'm unsure. I avoided the topic as much as possible. But I knew I couldn't keep that up forever. At some point, I'd have to make a choice, and whatever I decided would change things between us, for better or worse. I just didn't know which way it would go. After that talk with my uncle about the name change, things didn't just magically improve. If anything, they got worse. Every time we were in the same space, it felt like he was silently waiting for me to bring it up. The silence between us seemed louder than before. It wasn't just about him wanting me to change my name, it was like our entire relationship had shifted, and that made everything feel more awkward at home. I tried to ignore it, focusing on work and pretending everything was fine, but it's hard to escape from the tension in your own home, you know? My uncle and I used to communicate more frequently, and even though we weren't ones to have deep emotional conversations, we still had a decent bond. Now, though, it felt like he was pulling away, and I could sense it. One evening, he called me into his office. He was at his desk, papers scattered everywhere like he had been going over finances or something. But judging by the look on his face, this wasn't about work. He didn't waste time and directly asked if I had given more thought to his offer. As soon as he mentioned it, the air in the room grew heavy, like a weight had settled between us. I told him I had been thinking about it, which was true, but I still didn't have an answer that would make everything better. It's a huge deal, I explained. Changing my last name feels like I'm losing a part of who I am. He didn't respond right away, just leaned back in his chair, studying me as if trying to gauge my reaction. Finally, he said, "It's not about losing something, it's about embracing who you are and your roots." It felt like he didn't fully understand my perspective, or maybe he did, which was why this was so important to him. I told him once again that I wasn't sure and needed more time to think it over, and that's when he hit me with, "Time won't change anything. Either you understand what this means to me, or you don't." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a casual request for him. For my uncle, this was about respect, loyalty, and family. He wasn't simply asking me to take his name for the sake of it. He genuinely believed that, by raising me, he had earned the right to ask this of me, and in his eyes I should want to do it. But to me it felt like I was giving up control over something that still belonged to me, my name, my identity, the last part of my past that hadn't been touched. I repeated that I wasn't ready to make a decision, but I could see the frustration on his face. He wasn't going to push me, but it was clear that this wasn't going to disappear. After that, the atmosphere between us grew colder. He wasn't rude or anything, but we no longer talked like we used to. He stopped asking about my work or checking in on how I was doing. I felt more like a guest in the house than part of the family. My aunt didn't help much either. She avoided the topic altogether, and James stayed quiet, though I wasn't sure if he even knew what was happening. I didn't want to drag him into it, since this was really between me and my uncle. I kept thinking about what my friends had said, that I was being ungrateful and should just go along with it. But it wasn't that simple for me. I didn't want to feel like I was being bought with a house, even though that's kind of how it felt. I didn't want to change my name just to keep the peace. And then there was the whole community aspect. People would definitely notice if I suddenly had a different last name, and I'd have to explain it every time. It wasn't only about what my uncle thought, but also how others would see me. Weeks passed, and the tension remained, hanging over everything. Every morning I woke up with this sinking feeling in my stomach, knowing that sooner or later the issue would come up again. And then it did. One Saturday, my uncle called a family meeting. I'd never been in one before, so I knew immediately this wasn't going to be a casual chat. We all sat down in the living room, my uncle, my aunt, James, and me. My uncle looked serious, but not angry, just worn out. He started talking about the importance of family, how names carry significance in our culture, and how he had always considered me his son, even though it wasn't official. I knew where this was going. He wanted me to make my decision in front of everyone. "I need to know your decision," he said, looking directly at me. Everyone's eyes were on me, waiting for what I was going to say. My aunt, who had mostly stayed silent, was suddenly very interested in my answer. James didn't say anything, but he was watching closely too. I took a moment to gather my thoughts. "I understand why this matters to you," I began, and I could see my uncle nodding like he expected me to agree. "But I'm just not ready to change my name." The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. My uncle just stared at me, processing my words, while my aunt quietly stood up and left the room without saying a word. James followed her, leaving just me and my uncle sitting there. He let out a deep, frustrated sigh and said, "You're making a mistake." I wanted to argue, to explain myself again, but what was the point? He wasn't going to change his mind, and neither was I, at least not right then. So I just nodded and got up to leave. As I walked out, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. I had stood my ground, but but I had also made things even more complicated. I had no idea how we would move forward from this, but one thing was clear: nothing would be the same after that conversation, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I was ready for that either. After the family meeting, the vibe at home was completely different. It's hard to describe, but you know when something's wrong, and no one's talking about it. You can feel it in the air, but everyone's pretending like things are normal. That's how it was. My uncle didn't bring up the name change again, but I knew he wasn't happy. He wasn't the type to sulk or make passive-aggressive remarks. Instead, he just went silent, letting the quiet do the talking. I tried not to let it affect me, but it did. How could it not? Every time I walked into a room, it felt like he was disappointed in me, and it was a terrible feeling. My aunt, on the other hand, barely looked at me anymore. Before, we weren't exactly close, but at least we were civil. Now, she didn't even bother with the niceties. If I said good morning, she'd act like she hadn't heard me, like I wasn't even there. James was the only one who seemed the same. He never mentioned the situation, and I was grateful for that. We still hung out, played video games, grabbed food, and joked around like we always had. But I knew he was aware of everything going on with my uncle and aunt. He wasn't dumb; he could feel the tension too, but I respected that he didn't want to get involved. As the weeks went on, I started feeling more and more isolated. It's a strange feeling, living in a house where you no longer feel welcome. It wasn't like I thought my uncle would kick me out or anything. I knew he wouldn't do that, but it just didn't feel like home anymore. I began spending more time outside the house, staying late at work or hanging out with friends more often. I didn't want to stay in that uncomfortable atmosphere, even though I knew avoiding it wasn't going to solve anything. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep dodging the issue forever. I didn't want things to remain like this, but I also didn't know how to fix it. The name issue was still looming over everything, and I wasn't sure how to move forward without giving in. Every time I thought about it, I felt stuck, like no matter what choice I made, someone would end up getting hurt. One evening, I was in my room scrolling through my phone when I heard a knock at my door. It was my uncle. That wasn't unusual. He'd knocked on my door plenty of times before, but this time it felt different. He hadn't come to my room in a while, so when I opened the door and saw him standing there, I got this uneasy feeling. He asked if we could talk, and I instantly knew what it was about. We sat down in my room, and without wasting time, he got straight to the point. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," he said, referring to the name situation. I braced myself, expecting him to push the issue again, but instead he surprised me. "I don't want this to keep hanging over us," he continued. "I've been hard on you, and maybe I haven't been as fair as I should have been." I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't expected him to apologize, but that's what it felt like in his own way. He wasn't saying I'm sorry. But he was admitting that things hadn't been right between us, and that was enough for me. "I'm not trying to force you into something you don't want to do," he went on, "but I need you to understand why this is so important to me. I've always seen you as my son, and in our culture, that means something. It's not just about the name, it's about family and making things official." I could feel how much this meant to him, and I understood his perspective, but that didn't make it any easier. I didn't want to hurt him, but at the same time, I didn't want to feel like I was losing a part of myself. "I get it," I told him, and I truly did, but it's just hard for me. My name is all I have left from before everything changed. I don't want to lose that." He nodded, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like we were actually having a real conversation, not just talking at each other. "I'm not asking you to give up your past," he said. "I'm asking you to build on it. This isn't about erasing who you are, it's about adding to it." I sat there for a moment, thinking about what he said. I still wasn't sure if I could do it, but now, at least, it felt like he understood why I was struggling with the decision. He wasn't just making demands anymore, he was explaining his reasons and trying to meet me halfway. "I don't want this to come between us," he added after a long pause, "but I need you to know how much this means to me." I didn't have a response for him right then, so I told him I needed more time to think about it, and he didn't press me. He just nodded and said he understood, then left me alone to figure things out. After he left, I felt a bit better, like maybe there was a way to make this work without anyone getting hurt. But I also knew I still wasn't ready to give him an answer. Changing my name, even for someone who had done so much for me, still felt like too much. I wasn't ready to let go of that yet. But at least now I didn't feel like I was facing this decision completely alone. My uncle had opened the door for a real conversation, and that was more than I had expected. I still didn't know what I was going to do, but at least now it felt like we were closer to being on the same page. Over the next few days, things felt lighter. The tension wasn't entirely gone, but it wasn't as intense as before. My aunt still kept her distance, but I noticed she wasn't as cold. Maybe my uncle had spoken to her, or maybe she was just giving me the space to figure things out. James, as usual, didn't bring it up, but he was around more. We hung out like we used to, and it felt good to have that sense of normalcy back. It wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. I still had a major decision to make, and I knew that whatever I chose would change things, one way or another. But for the first time in a while, I felt like maybe I wasn't as trapped as I had thought. Maybe there was a way forward without losing everything or hurting the people I cared about. I just had to figure out what that path looked like.
A few weeks passed after that talk with my uncle, and things definitely improved. But I could still feel the weight of the decision hanging over me. It wasn't as tense as it had been, but the issue of changing my name was still there, lingering in the background. Sometimes I'd be at work trying to focus, and suddenly it would pop into my mind. No matter how much time went by, it just wouldn't go away. I knew I had to make a decision eventually. My uncle hadn't brought it up again, but I could tell he was waiting. He had given me the space I needed, but at some point he was going to need an answer, and I couldn't avoid it forever.
One Saturday morning, I decided to go for a drive. I didn't do that often, but sometimes I just needed to get out of the house and clear my mind. I ended up driving for a couple of hours, not really headed anywhere, just thinking. I kept running through the same thoughts, what it would mean to change my name, and what it would mean if I didn't. Both options felt heavy, like there was no easy way out. Eventually, I pulled over at a small park I used to visit when I was younger. It was quiet, with a few benches scattered around, and not many people were there. I sat down on one of the benches and let my mind wander, trying to figure out what I really wanted. Did I want to change my name from my uncle, or was I holding on to it because it was the last thing I had from my old life? From my mom? It was a tough question. I loved my uncle, and I knew how much he had done for me. He had been more of a father to me than my actual dad ever was. But the name change felt like such a personal decision, and I didn't want to feel pressured into it, even if that pressure wasn't intentional. Sitting there in the park, I thought about my mom. I wondered what she would have wanted. Would she have wanted me to take my uncle's name, or would she have preferred that I keep my own? I didn't know, and it frustrated me that I'd never have an answer. In that moment, I missed her more than I had in a long time. I wanted her to tell me what to do, to help me make the right choice. I must have sat there for around an hour just thinking, before I finally got up and drove home. I didn't have a clear answer yet, but I felt like I was getting closer. I couldn't keep going back and forth forever eventually. I would have to choose, even if it wasn't a perfect decision. Later that evening, when I returned home, my uncle was sitting in the living room watching TV. It was the first time in a while that I felt like I might be able to talk to him without things feeling awkward. I wasn't entirely sure if I was ready to give him an answer, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. I sat down beside him on the couch, and for a moment we just watched TV in silence. I don't even remember what was on, it didn't really matter. After a while, I turned to him and said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said." He switched off the TV and looked at me, giving me his full attention, as if he knew this was the moment we had both been waiting for. "I know how important the name is to you," I began, "and I understand why you want me to change it. You've done so much for me, and I'm really grateful. I wouldn't be where I am without you." He nodded but didn't say anything, just waited for me to finish. "But I'm still not sure if I'm ready to change my name," I continued. "It's not that I don't appreciate everything you've done for me, but it feels like a huge part of who I am. It's one of the few things left from my past, from before everything changed." I could see him thinking about what I was saying, and for the first time, it felt like he truly understood. He wasn't just focused on his own feelings, he was trying to understand mine. "I'm not saying no," I added quickly, "but I need more time. I don't want to rush into this and make a decision I'll regret later." He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath as if processing everything I had said, then looked at me and replied, "I get it. I really do. I don't want to force you into something you're not ready for, but I want you to know how much this means to me." There was a long pause after that, but it wasn't the awkward silence we had before. It felt like we were finally on the same page, even if we didn't have all the answers yet. "I appreciate that," I said, "and I want you to know this isn't about me not wanting to be part of this family. You've been like a father to me, and that's never going to change, no matter what my last name is." That seemed to resonate with him, and I could tell he understood what I was trying to convey. "I'm proud of you, he said after a moment, "no matter what name you decide to go by." Hearing him say that, especially after everything, meant more to me than I could express. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, even though the decision was still looming. "Thanks," I said, unsure of what else to say. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but for now it was enough. We sat there for a while longer, not really talking, but just being in the same room without the tension that had been hanging over us for weeks. It wasn't ideal, and I knew the decision was still ahead of me, but at least I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of it alone anymore. My uncle understood, and for now, that was enough. I didn't know when I'd make my final decision, but I knew that when I did, it would be for the right reasons, not out of guilt or pressure, but because I had thought it through and made the choice that was best for me. And that felt like a step in the right direction. Update 2. After that conversation with my uncle, things didn't exactly go back to how they were, but the tension was definitely lighter. We didn't really bring up the name change again, and I think we both silently agreed to give it some space. It wasn't like the issue had disappeared, but the pressure wasn't as intense anymore. He understood my perspective, and I knew how much it meant to him. That made it easier to be around each other again. The house also felt a bit more relaxed. My aunt wasn't as distant, and though she still kept some space, she wasn't outright ignoring me anymore. Sometimes I'd catch her giving me a small nod when we passed each other in the hallway or kitchen, and honestly, I'd take that over complete silence. It was a start. James and I stayed as close as ever. He still didn't bring up the situation, and I appreciated that more than he probably realized. He could have easily taken sides or made things awkward, but he didn't. We just kept doing our usual thing, playing games and hanging out. It was nice to have something that stayed the same while everything else felt like it was shifting. But even though things were calmer at home, I couldn't stop thinking about the decision. Every time I thought I had made up my mind, I would second-guess myself. On one hand, taking my uncle's last name felt like a meaningful way to acknowledge everything he had done for me, like I was showing appreciation for all the ways he had been there when no one else was. On the other hand, it still felt like I was letting go of a part of myself. I wasn't sure if I could do that, no matter how much I cared for him. I started going back to the park on weekends just to think. Being away from the house, away from the pressure, helped clear my head. I'd sit on the same bench for hours, watching people pass by and letting my mind wander. Sometimes I wondered if I was making this a bigger deal than it needed to be. Maybe it was just a name, and I was holding on to something that didn't matter as much as I thought. But every time I got close to convincing myself of that, I'd feel this pull, like deep down, I knew it mattered. It wasn't just a name, it was my past, my mom, and everything that had happened before I moved in with my uncle. Changing my name felt like closing the door on that part of my life, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. There wasn't a deadline, not one that my uncle had given me, at least, but I knew I couldn't leave it unresolved forever. I needed to make a decision for both of us.